On a bitterly cold winter night, a stray French bulldog moved cautiously through the snow-covered park, its frail body trembling against the icy wind. As the snow fell relentlessly, the city lay blanketed in silence. The streets, usually bustling with life, were deserted under the soft orange glow of flickering streetlights. Snow piled high along the edges, muffling every sound except for the occasional gust of wind that rattled bare branches and sent icy particles swirling through the air. Each breath turned to visible puffs of frost, a fleeting reminder of the biting cold that seeped into everything it touched. The park, tucked away on the outskirts of the city, appeared almost otherworldly in the snowstorm. The once green expanse was now a vast sea of white, punctuated only by skeletal trees and empty benches standing like lonely sentinels. The wind howled through the open space, carrying the sharp sting of winter and a sense of unyielding desolation. Amid the quiet, a faint cry broke through, almost imperceptible at first. It wasn't the wind or the creaking of trees, but something softer, more vulnerable. The sound carried desperation that cut through the cold night like a fragile thread of hope. It came from the heart of the park, where shadows danced under the dim light of a lone lamp. A figure moved there, small and barely visible against the swirling snow. As the shadow grew clearer, its movements revealed urgency. The figure was not just a solitary wanderer, but the beginning of an untold story, etched in desperation and resilience. It moved purposefully toward the faint cry, navigating the relentless snowstorm with unwavering determination. Underneath a weathered wooden bench at the edge of the park, the scene was both heart-wrenching and surreal. A tiny baby, swaddled in mismatched blankets, lay trembling on the icy ground. The infant's cheeks were pale as though the cold had stolen all color, and its small hands peeked out, quivering with each labored breath. Beside the baby was the same stray French bulldog, curled protectively around the child. The dog's patchy, matted fur offered scant protection against the unforgiving cold. It shivered violently, breath visible in the frozen air, yet it refused to move away. Instead, it pressed closer to the infant, dark eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. Each trembling movement of its thin body spoke of a fierce loyalty, a desire to shield the baby from the biting winds threatening to extinguish their fragile existence. Half buried in snow, the bench framed the moment like a tragic painting. The blankets covering the baby were thin and mismatched, offering little protection against the storm. The ground beneath them had frozen solid, and the baby's whimper barely rose above the howling wind. The dog's ears twitched with each gust, its body adjusting instinctively to block the cold. Though clearly malnourished and exhausted, the French bulldog displayed a determination that transcended its fragile state. Its eyes flicked toward the distant sound of footsteps, yet it remained focused on its task, protecting the life beside it. The atmosphere carried a haunting beauty: silent park, relentless snow, and a fragile tableau of survival. It was a scene easy to miss in the storm's vastness, but for anyone who stumbled upon it, it would leave an indelible mark. The bond between the baby and the dog, two vulnerable lives fighting the odds, was a testament to spirit and resilience in the harshest conditions. As the wind picked up, adding another layer of snow, the faint cry persisted, a sound that could pierce even the coldest heart. The French bulldog quivered, not from fear but from the effort of keeping the baby warm. Together they were a picture of endurance and hope, their silent plea for salvation echoing in the frozen night. Clara Hayes tightened the scarf around her neck, her breath forming delicate clouds in the freezing air. It had been another long, demanding shift at the hospital, leaving her feet aching and her mind buzzing with exhaustion. Yet she had her ritual, a walk through the park on her way home. It was her favorite time of day, the only moments when she could truly exhale and let the silence wash over her. The park was her refuge, a quiet expanse that stretched between her workplace and her modest apartment. The crunch of snow beneath her boots was rhythmic and almost meditative as she followed the familiar path, winding through the frosted trees. She welcomed the cold air, which cleared her mind after hours of fluorescent lights and the constant hum of hospital machinery. Tonight, though, something felt different. The usual peacefulness of the park seemed heavier, as if the air carried a hidden weight. Clara paused, pulling her coat tighter around herself, and gazed at the snow-covered benches lining the path. The place that usually soothed her now felt eerily empty. Suddenly she heard it, a sound that made her stop mid-step. A faint cry, almost too soft to be real, cut through the stillness. At first, Clara thought it might be the wind, but when she listened closely, it was unmistakable. A small, distressed sound carried on the biting wind. Her heart raced as she tried to pinpoint the noise. She turned toward the darker, unlit side of the park, where tree shadows stretched across the snow. The cry was faint but persistent, tugging at something deep inside her. Hands trembling, she lifted her flashlight, its beam slicing through the swirling snow. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her breath fogged the air as she took a hesitant step forward, then another, curiosity overtaking her exhaustion. The shortcut she had taken so often now felt unfamiliar, each step into the park pulling her further from routine and safety. The cries grew louder. Clara's grip on the flashlight tightened, her pulse quickening with every careful step. The path was slippery and the snow muffled her movements, adding to the unsettling stillness. She swept the flashlight beam ahead, scanning the ground until it landed on something beneath a weathered wooden bench. Her breath caught in her throat. The light revealed a tiny form swaddled in tattered blankets. A baby, impossibly small, trembling on the frozen ground. Clara froze, her mind reeling at the sight. The infant's cheeks were tinted with an alarming shade of blue, its small hands barely visible beneath layers of cloth. Weak, labored movement signaled how dire the situation was. Beside the child, a French bulldog crouched, its thin body shaking violently in the cold. Patchy, matted fur and starkly visible ribs showed its suffering, yet it shielded the baby from the icy wind. The dog's dark eyes met Clara's, filled with fear, resolve, and an unspoken plea. "Oh my God," Clara whispered, her voice barely above the wind. She dropped to her knees, flashlight wobbling in her grip. The scene before her, the fragile baby, the shivering dog, the encroaching snow, was almost too much to bear. The dog growled softly as Clara leaned closer. It was a low warning sound that wasn't entirely threatening, more a cautionary signal that this child was under its protection. Clara lowered herself, voice trembling but calm. "It's okay," she murmured, holding out her gloved hand. "I'm not going to hurt you." Her gentle tone carried the urgency she felt in her chest. The dog's growl faded, though its wary eyes never left her. Focusing on the baby's faint cries, Clara carefully gathered the small bundle into her arms. A jolt of urgency shot through her as she felt the child's icy skin. "You're freezing," she whispered, voice breaking. "We need to get you warm." The dog stood, legs shaking but spirit unbroken, ready to follow Clara's lead. She hesitated, meeting its gaze. "You've been protecting this baby, haven't you?" she said softly. The dog managed a faint wag of its tail. Without another word, Clara rose, cradling the baby tight. "Come on," she whispered to the dog, gesturing toward the path. It hesitated only briefly before walking beside her. Together they left the bench and the shadows, carrying a fragile story into the night. Clara's flashlight quivered in her trembling hands as its beam settled on the scene beneath the bench. Her breath caught in her throat. The baby's tiny hands peeked from under a mismatched blanket, fragile and pale as though the cold had drained all warmth. Each shallow breath was a struggle against the freezing air. The blanket, thin and worn, offered little protection from the relentless cold. Beside the baby, a French bulldog lay curled, its frail body pressed tightly against the child. Its ribs were painfully visible with each breath, and its matted coat was no match for the biting cold. Yet it refused to abandon the child. The dog's dark eyes, wide and reflective in the flashlight's glow, held a blend of fear and resolve. Despite its suffering, it stayed steadfast. Snow gathered on the edges of the blanket and the dog's fur, showing how long they had been exposed. The night was eerily quiet, broken only by the baby's faint cries and the whistle of wind. The dog's ears twitched, fully alert to Clara's presence as it tried to curl even closer around the child. "Oh my God," Clara whispered, voice trembling with shock and urgency. Kneeling down, she ignored the chill seeping through her pants. Her pulse pounded in her ears, and a wave of fear, helplessness, and an overwhelming need to act washed over her. Tears stung her eyes as she looked from the baby to the dog. The infant's tiny frame was so fragile, and the dog, though starving and cold, had assumed the role of a fierce protector. Clara's heart ached at the silent bond between them, forged by desperation and survival. "I'm here to help," she murmured, voice quivering. Reaching out a gloved hand, Clara moved slowly. The baby whimpered, its weak cry tugging at her heartstrings in a way she had never felt. The dog growled low as Clara inched closer, its body tensing. It wasn't menacing, but more a warning. "Be careful. A life depends on me." Its eyes locked on hers, revealing equal measures of fear and unyielding determination. Clara froze, hand still in midair. She saw the animal's fear and realized it was acting out of protection, not aggression. Its trembling limbs betrayed exhaustion, yet it remained on guard. Swallowing hard, Clara said softly, "It's okay. You've done so well. You've been so brave." The dog's growl lessened, though its gaze stayed locked on her. Clara could see it wrestling with the decision to trust her or not. Slowly, she knelt lower, flashlight angled away to avoid startling the dog further. "I just want to help," she whispered, voice almost pleading. The baby stirred, letting out a faint cry that broke the tension. Clara's heart lurched at the sight of the child's pale cheeks and trembling hands. Every second in the cold was precious. The dog's posture softened into a low whine. It glanced at the baby, then back at Clara, as though weighing its options. Clara seized the moment, moving slowly until she could reach the baby. She lifted the infant gently, wrapping it in her arms. The baby's skin was ice cold, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. The dog stood on shaky legs and whined again, stepping closer. Clara held its gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. "Come on," she said softly, beckoning it to follow. "We're getting you both warm and safe." The dog hesitated only briefly before stepping in beside her. Together they left the bench and the shadows behind, forging a fragile bond built on hope. Clara knelt carefully, breath clouding in the freezing air as she extended her hand toward the baby. "It's okay, I'm here to help," she murmured, hoping the softness of her voice would comfort both the infant and the dog. Moving slowly, she draped her warm scarf over the baby's frail body. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small shield against the relentless cold. The baby whimpered faintly, a sound barely audible above the wind. Clara's chest constricted as she adjusted the scarf, her fingers trembling. She glanced at the dog, which still watched her closely. Its posture remained tense, but its growls had softened into low whines. Less a warning, more a plea. Clara steadied her breathing, knowing it needed to sense her calm. Clara slowly extended her gloved hand toward the dog, fingers open. "You've been so brave," she said gently. The dog hesitated, body rigid, then sniffed her glove. Clara stayed perfectly still, allowing the animal to come closer on its own terms. After a moment, the dog's nose brushed her hand. Its body relaxed a fraction, eyes still cautious but no longer hostile. "You're protecting this baby," Clara whispered, voice thick with emotion. "I'm here to help. Let me help." The dog tilted its head slightly, seeming to weigh her words. Then it stepped back just enough for her to move nearer to the infant. Clara's heart swelled with relief as she gathered the baby into her arms, feeling the small body shudder against the cold. The infant stirred at the warmth of her embrace. Tears pricked at Clara's eyes, but she steadied herself. The dog edged closer, brushing against Clara's leg and letting out a soft whine. She looked down, her own emotions surging at the animal's obvious concern for the child. An unspoken bond was forming, a quiet alliance forged in hardship. "Come on," Clara said softly, shifting the baby so she could gesture to the dog. "Let's get you both warm." The dog hesitated, then followed. Outside, the wind roared, but Clara felt a flicker of hope. The three of them, bound by circumstance, had found a fragile chance at survival. The biting cold gnawed at Clara as she held the baby against her chest, arms shaking with urgency. The child's cheeks were pale and lifeless, breathing shallow. Clara recognized the signs of hypothermia. She clutched the baby closer, trying to shield it from the brutal wind. Every second in the cold felt like an hour. She glanced at the French bulldog plodding beside her, its legs shaking with every step. Its ribs stood out beneath its patchy fur, and it was clearly exhausted, but it refused to lag behind. Clara's throat tightened. Both the infant and the dog were on the brink of survival. She had to act quickly. Clara quickened her pace, boots crunching through the snow as she hurried to her apartment. Her mind raced, formulating a plan. The baby needed warmth immediately, and both needed medical attention. She whispered encouragement to the dog as they climbed the building steps. "Almost there," she said, breath visible in the night air. Once inside, she wasted no time. The warmth of the apartment was a stark contrast to the freezing park. Gently placing the baby on her couch, she piled blankets over its tiny frame. The dog collapsed onto the rug, trembling but alert. With shaking fingers, Clara called emergency services. "I found a baby outside in the park, freezing, possibly hypothermic. There's also a dog that's been protecting it. Both are in bad shape." The operator's voice was steady, guiding Clara on how to keep the baby warm until help arrived. She hung up, heart pounding, and hurried back to the child. She placed a warm water bottle near the baby to provide extra heat. The child stirred weakly but made no sound. Clara felt for a pulse. Faint, but there. She met the dog's gaze as it whined softly. "You've done so much," she said, voice cracking. "We're not losing them now." Minutes felt like hours. Clara soothed the dog with gentle strokes, forcing down her own anxiety. The weight of it all pressed on her, but she refused to surrender to fear. This fragile trio, united by chance, was fighting for life, and Clara was determined they would win. Clara adjusted the blankets around the baby, her hands shaking with cautious hope. The apartment's warmth, aided by a small space heater, gradually chased away the chill clinging to the infant. A faint flush returned to the baby's cheeks, a fragile but welcome sign. Clara lightly placed her fingers on the baby's wrist and detected a slightly stronger pulse. Nearby, the French bulldog had stopped trembling. It lay curled on a soft rug, head on its paws. Clara put out a bowl of leftover stew. After a wary pause, the dog ate in slow, careful bites. When it was finished, it crept closer to the couch, eyes still locked on the baby. Clara exhaled, a wave of relief washing over her, as the fear of the park gave way to cautious optimism. Over the next few hours, the baby's breathing stabilized, shallow gasps replaced by more regular inhales and exhales. Clara sat on the floor beside the couch, one hand on the baby's blanket while she offered her other hand to the dog. Slowly, it edged closer until it allowed her to gently stroke its head. "You're a hero," she whispered. The dog looked up, tail giving the faintest wag. Clara's heart clenched with gratitude and respect for the brave creature that had saved a life. As the dog rested its head on Clara's lap, she felt the enormity of the night's events settle over her. Compassion, she realized, could be found in the simplest acts. A stray dog had given everything to protect a vulnerable child, and a passing stranger had answered their silent plea. Those small, instinctive acts of care had bridged despair and hope. Clara's gaze shifted to the baby, now sleeping peacefully under warm blankets. She smiled, the heaviness in her chest lifting. The three of them, brought together by circumstance, had endured the storm. In their shared warmth, they found hope. Days later, Clara got the call she had been hoping for. The baby's parents had been located. They arrived at the hospital, tearful and overwhelmed with relief. Their gratitude poured out in every word and gesture. Clara stood back, watching with a full heart as the parents held their child close, tears of joy mingling with profound thanks. When the baby was finally returned to its parents, Clara felt a subtle ache in her chest. She had grown attached during those tense hours. Still, pride in having saved the child overshadowed the sadness. By her side, the dog, now named Buddy, sat loyally watching the reunion with quiet understanding. Clara vowed he would never feel abandoned again. Once frail and frightened, Buddy now moved with renewed strength. His coat shone and his tail wagged freely. The baby, too, had transformed from a fragile figure on the brink of despair into a symbol of resilience. Together, they were living proof of the power of compassion and second chances. A soft fire crackled in the quiet room as Clara relaxed in her favorite armchair, a warm blanket over her lap. Buddy lay curled at her feet, chest rising and falling in peaceful sleep. The night outside was as cold and unyielding as the one that had brought them together, but inside there was warmth and comfort. Clara stared into the flames, recalling the desperation, urgency, and unbreakable bond that had formed in the park. She reached down to scratch Buddy's ears, brushing against his now glossy coat. "It's amazing what love can do," she whispered, smiling. "Even the smallest acts can save lives." Her thoughts shifted outward, heart filling with gratitude and hope. If this story moved you, consider opening your heart to those in need, whether it's a stray animal looking for a home or a vulnerable child needing kindness. Compassion isn't about grand gestures. It's found in everyday choices to care, to give, and to love. Those small actions can change the world, one life at a time.